Hello World History class. This is a video that is going to give you some support on the wars in Korea and Vietnam quiz. Okay, so let's get into it. Here we go. So this is on this chapter 33.3, and the first question I wanted to relate to what we've studied already. What imperialist nation controlled Korea during and before World War II? And if you remember, that's from imperialism. This is one of the, this is from Punch magazine, and this is where they're carving up China. And you have these different representations of imperialism. The one that controlled part of China as well as Korea is right here. It's Japan, and there's my doorbell. I wonder what that is. Okay. So Japan controlled Korea before World War II. It was part of the Japanese Empire. However, after Japan's defeated, and this happens again in Vietnam when they're defeated, when they leave, then other people try to fill that vacuum. And after World War II, after the Japanese left, Korea was divided similarly to Germany. One half was claimed by the Soviet Union, the other half was claimed by the United States. And the North is loyal to the Soviets and the South loyal to the Americans. So that would be the answer right there. And that's my joke about the BTS, the Korean boy band group, which is incorrect. Okay. What nation initiated aggression in 1950 to begin the Korean War? And the North Koreans did. With the backing or the support of the Soviet Union, the North Koreans invaded the South. And at that point, did Truman, the President of the United States, appease the North Koreans? Did he let them be the aggressors in order to keep the peace? No, he did not. So he did not appease the North Koreans. And he had a new organization that we read about last week, the United Nations. He went to the UN and he said, we have to act and we have to be together and act. Imagine if the League of Nations had been able to do this when Hitler invaded the Rhineland, the demilitarized zone, or went into Spain during the Spanish Civil War, or into Czechoslovakia. If they all came together and helped out. Well, this is what the United Nations did. They sent an international force of 15 nations to fight North Korea. And of course, the United States was the one who bore most of the burden. We had the largest number of troops there. And it was led by General MacArthur, the same man who had just controlled Japan shortly after World War II. He was, and we'll see that MacArthur, he has a genius move where he lands at Incheon, up the Korean Peninsula. Let's see, where is it? I'll just blow this up a little bit. So the North Koreans invade, and they invade down into the south, and they get all the way down here, where this is the only area around Busan where the ones loyal to the south are. But MacArthur, he lands the Marines up here at Incheon and is able to attack from this side and that side, defeats half the entire army, and then he pursues them up into North Korea. And this is where MacArthur makes a big mistake. He is too proud, and his power is getting to his head. And he starts making these sort of imperial decisions. You can tell he was basically the imperial commander, basically controlled Japan, and now he's controlling Korea. He pushes them. See this right here, the Yalu? This is the river that separates, this is the border between North Korea and China. And he pushes the North Korean army almost to there. He also tells Truman that it would be a good idea to use nuclear weapons against the Chinese. Now, Truman, who's already used nuclear weapons against the Japanese and saw the horrific effects of that, does not want to be known for dropping more than, for initiating more than one nuclear war. And so two results of what MacArthur did is one, over 300,000 Chinese troops allied with the North Koreans fought the Americans. So now instead of just fighting the North Koreans, sorry, my hand's getting in the way, that's a rookie mistake. Instead of just fighting the North Koreans, the Chinese, a huge nation, sends its troops to fight the Americans. So that's one result. Secondly, Truman, the President of the United States, fired General MacArthur and replaced him. because MacArthur had overstepped his bounds. Let's say he just stopped right here instead of pushing toward the Chinese border, then maybe the Chinese wouldn't have gotten involved. But because he did, this war is going to go on even longer. This is incorrect. He did not drop atomic bombs. This is incorrect. So these first two right here. How many people died in the Korean War? This is from 1950 to roughly 1953. It is an astounding 4 million people. And remember, during wartime, it's not just from battle. It's also because you have agriculture. People aren't unable to grow food. Disease spreads. And so many people die of famine. Many people die of disease. It was an absolute human catastrophe, 4 million people. Kim Il-sung is the North Korean leader who takes control of North Korea after World War II. And his son, Kim Jong-il, and then his son, Kim Jong-un, so is the current dictator of North Korea. They have made themselves, let's see, where is it in the reading here? Let's see. Okay, in North Korea, see right here where that is. In North Korea, the communist dictator Kim Il-sung established collective farms, developed heavy industry, and built up the military. If you remember when we were studying totalitarianism, this is exactly what Stalin did. Remember the Holodomor, the famine in the Ukraine, when he was collectivizing agriculture, over 40 million farms seized by the government. Heavy industry, remember the 5-year plans, and then building up the military, the massive industrialization. This is the blueprint for communist societies. It happened in North Korea. It also happened in China, where there's collective agriculture, heavy industry, and then the building up of the military. And so therefore, what leader did Kim Il-sung model himself on? It was Joseph Stalin. It's why Kim Il-sung is known as a Stalinist, also with a cult of personality, with extreme censorship, and he also has these paranoid ideas that's been passed on through his grandson, the current leader of North Korea, who is a megalomaniac, which means obsessed with himself and power, and militaristic, and does not care about the vulnerable people in his society. What type of government dominated South Korea into the late 1980s? Now you'd think, because the North is a dictatorship, actually the South until the 1980s was also a dictatorship, but it was a dictatorship that was friendly to the United States. And we're going to see during this unit about containment that just because the United States is fighting communism, it doesn't mean that they're creating democracies and supporting democracies around the world. We'll see that we supported dictators throughout the world, whether it was in Asia or Latin America or Africa, and just as long as they pledged their allegiance to us. And so this time of the Cold War is not necessarily democracy versus communism. It really is two imperialist nations, the USSR and the United States, competing against each other for supremacy in the world. After Japan is defeated at the end of World War II, what European imperialist country resumed dominating Vietnam? And so, going back here, at the end of World War II, so Korea is at the very top of China in the northeast, and then at the southwest of China is Vietnam, and it was controlled by, right here, there's Marianne, the symbol of France. Also, she's the symbol of liberty, which is pretty hypocritical because she's dominating a place and not giving people liberty. Also, it's strange that she's a woman because women did not have the right to vote in France until 1945. Anyway, France resumed dominating Vietnam after the end of World War II. Instead of giving Vietnam to the Vietnamese, France went back. Why would they do that? Think of imperialism. It's all about economics. They wanted the money. The tire company you may be familiar with, Michelin or Michelin, it is a French rubber company, and those rubber plantations of Vietnam were extremely lucrative for them. Also, if you go to Vietnam, we have a lot of Vietnamese, a huge Vietnamese community in Southern California. There's a sandwich called the banh mi, and it's really good. It has French bread on it. It has a mixture of French and Asian flavors, and it's a result of imperialism. So even though imperialism leaves a bitter taste in most people's mouths, there are also interesting cultural cuisine associated with it. But that's just like a little silver lining. Okay. Who led Vietnam's resistance against the Japanese, French, and later the United States? This freedom fighter was named Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh. And he actually was, as a young man, he was at the Versailles Conference in 1919 trying to argue to give Vietnam to the Vietnamese instead of the French. But of course, that conference in Versailles with the French, they laughed at Ho Chi Minh, not realizing that later, just 40 years later, his troops would defeat the French and later drive out the Americans in the first war that we lost. Okay. What type of tactics did the Viet Minh use against the superior technology of the French and later American military power? They're called the Viet Minh. Later, they're called the Viet Cong. And this is a guerrilla group. And guerrilla, right? Like little wars, skirmishes, and booby traps, and hit and run tactics. Blending in with the population. This is what we first saw when Napoleon occupied Spain with the French, and then the people were dressed as civilians and fighting against superior French forces, but able to drive out the French. Similarly, the Viet Cong developed these same tactics. But like we saw in the painting, the 8th of May, where the French troops are firing on civilians from Spain, civilians become targets in this war because the occupying army can't tell who's a civilian and who is not, and so it leads to extreme actions and torture and war crimes against the civilians from the occupying army. So guerrilla warfare is the answer there. Eisenhower's domino theory was a continuation of which of the following American policies? Eisenhower is the president after Harry Truman. He served for 2 terms from 1950 to 1958. Or 52 to 1960. And his domino theory was the idea of one country falls to communism, the country next to it will also fall to communism. And this is a continuation of this policy of containment, the idea that you need to stop communism from spreading. And so the war in Korea, the war in Vietnam were part of this domino theory. In their words, to protect the world from the spread of communism. However, at what cost do you protect, in quotes, the world from communism? Is it worth putting up dictators who abuse human rights? Is it worth losing tens of thousands of American lives and also destroying millions of lives in that country you're supposedly protecting? It became and we're still feeling the blowback of this today. How is Vietnam divided after the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu? This is, let me see. There it is. Okay, so, there's Ho Chi Minh. And here's Vietnam. At the end of World War II, just like in Korea, the Vietnams are divided. Here it's along the 15th parallel. Remember the globe latitude and longitude? This is the 15th parallel. And it goes right across. No, it was the 17th parallel that was divided. And so that's the division of the North and the South. And so after the French are defeated by the Vietnamese, there's a treaty and there's a communist North and an anti-communist South. Okay? And so it's divided right here. So a communist North and an anti-communist South. It is very similar to the story of Korea. South Vietnam's leaders were dictators as well. And so unfortunately, they could not say they're fighting communism with a better system because most of them were military dictators. They just had the support of the United States. And unfortunately, there were human rights violations on both sides, in the North and the South. The incident that caused the U.S. to increase the number of troops in South Vietnam to fight against the North was attacks on U.S. patrol boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. So we pretty much put these boats up here in North Vietnam almost to draw their fire. And there are even some today who say that the sinking of the boats here were calculated by the United States in order to draw us into a larger war. And so similarly to the Spanish-American War, where we had a ship in Cuba in the harbor, the Maine, that exploded, it then caused us to go to war. And so here there's an attack on these ships, and then we just had military advisors there, like a few thousand. And then in 1964, after the attack on the ship, Congress authorized the president to send hundreds of thousands of troops to Vietnam, and that's when there was a draft. And so the Gulf of Tonkin incident is what caused that to happen. Nations that supported the North Vietnamese, this is what became known as a proxy war. So even though we had American troops in South Vietnam, you wouldn't want China, because it was communist, or the Soviet Union to have troops fighting against each other. If all these countries were fighting against each other, then it could cause a nuclear war. So what the Soviets would do instead was just give weapons and give a lot of weapons and training to the North Vietnamese in order to fight American troops. They didn't want a direct conflict. And so this is what's known as a proxy war. You're fighting using a proxy. This is like if two people were about to fight, they knew that they would destroy the whole world. They just fight their friends instead. And so the nations that supported the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong are the guerrillas in the South who are fighting against the government who are allied with the North. China is supporting, and the USSR is supporting the North Vietnamese. And by 1968, over 500,000 US soldiers were in Vietnam, a huge amount of people. And in the video that I shared with you, you'll see many of them came from working class backgrounds, including hundreds of thousands of Latinos. And the story that you'll see at the end will be about, or in that video, if you have time to watch it, I suggest you do. It's pretty interesting. What other countries did the U.S. secretly bomb during the Vietnam War? So we bombed these two countries that we had not declared war on. And today, unfortunately, that happens fairly often. But back then, it was seen as against the rules of warfare. For example, you have drone strikes that happen today and all over the Middle East and Africa, where we have not declared war, but which to me is unconscionable. But today, we do have, in the 1960s and early 1970s, we were dropping bombs on Laos and Cambodia in secret. And we were doing that because the North Vietnamese were taking supplies from the North and putting them into the South, or making attacks from here into the South. But we had not officially declared war on Laos or Cambodia, but we were bombing them anyway in order to hit these military targets. It was known as carpet bombing. In 1968, you learned about this. There was, in one of the videos yesterday, about Hue, the old imperial city where U.S. Marines fought house to house in horrible combat until the end of the Vietnam War, where we abandoned and left Vietnam and fled and evacuated in 1975. And so Cambodia and Laos are the two countries that we bombed that we had not declared war on, but we were doing so in order to fight the Vietnamese. Okay, this is about Everett Alvarez, and he's in the video I shared with you. And he was shot down early. He was a pilot, and in 1964, right when we started bombing the North, he was shot down over North Vietnam in 1964 all the way until 1973. And so he was held prisoner in Vietnam by the Vietnamese, where he was tortured and interrogated and held in solitary confinement. So if you're in prison from 1964 to 1973, this would be a subtraction problem. Okay, and then, so that's 9 years. 9 years is not an option here. So which one is closest? I think you can figure that out. What's closest to 9 years? And you can see him speak, and he's really an incredible person. His persistence, his strength, and then his ability to find success after such a horrible incident, a horrible period of time in his life. He was deputy director of the Peace Corps. He was deputy administrator. The VA is the Veterans Administration. He founded a tech company. And so take a look at his story. It's on this PBS series. Nope, that's not it. There he is. And he's speaking about his time in growing up in Salinas, California, and also his time in the prison camp. And so another famous American who was in prison during that time was John McCain, who was a senator from Arizona who died a couple of years ago. But I think it's important to learn about not just the white men who typically got awards and more notoriety, but there were many other people, African Americans, Latinos, who were also sacrificing and fighting our wars, who, because we live in a racist country, did not get the same recognition that they deserved as much as the white people. And so that's why it's important we're looking at the history of the world, but we're also looking at it too through the lens of the United States, and in this case, in the Latino experience. All right, guys, that is it. I miss you. Hope you're doing well, and I hope this helps. Okay, bye-bye.